Then in lecture example 2.3, the acquiring company is going to settle the purchase consideration through a share exchange. So let's read through the information provided. Ronan Limited wants to acquire all of the ordinary shares in Keller Pty Limited, and the following information is applicable. So we've got the earnings per share as well as the number of shares in both companies. The purchase price is going to be settled through a share exchange of 1 share in Ronan Limited for every 4 shares held in Keller Pty Limited. So let's perform that calculation whilst we're here. If you look at Keller Limited, they have 1 million shares in issue, all right? And the purchase consideration is going to be settled with 1 share in Ronan for every 4 shares held in Keller Pty Limited. So Ronan Limited is going to issue 1 share for every 4 shares held in Keller, meaning that Ronan is going to issue 250,000 shares. So the shareholders of Keller Limited, before the acquisition, they have 1 million shares in Keller Limited. After the acquisition, they will hold 250,000 shares in Ronan Limited. Let's continue reading. Ronan Limited shares are currently trading at 4,800 cents per share. Now guys, you can use that information to calculate the purchase consideration. We know that Ronan is going to issue 250,000 shares, and those shares are currently trading at 4,800 cents per share. So the purchase consideration is 12 million rand. But it's important that you understand the shareholders of Keller Pty Limited are not going to be given 12 million rand for their shares. No, they are going to be given 250,000 shares in Ronan Limited, and those shares are worth 12 million rand, but they don't receive 12 million rand in cash. Let's finish reading. After-tax savings in overheads of 2 million rand per annum are expected from the acquisition. All right, so that's all of the information. I want you to analyze earnings per share after the acquisition. So we already have earnings per share before the acquisition. Now we need to calculate earnings per share after the acquisition. And remember, you calculate earnings per share by taking earnings and dividing by the number of shares in issue. Right. So guys, you have been given earnings per share for each company. You just need to multiply by the number of shares in issue so that you can get earnings in total. So just take the earnings per share, multiply by the number of shares in issue so that you can get the total earnings. Now please note guys, you weren't given any growth rate in the earnings, so you don't need to take any growth rate into account. Those are the earnings. In addition to that, you were told that Ronan Limited wants to acquire all of the ordinary shares in Keller Pty Limited, so you don't need to apportion the earnings of Keller Pty Limited. They will be buying all of the shares or 100% of the shares. However, we were told that after-tax savings in overheads of 2 million rand per annum are expected from the acquisition. So obviously that will have a positive impact on earnings after the acquisition. There will be overhead savings of 2 million rand. Please note that that saving is already after tax, so don't multiply by 72%. So that gives us earnings after the acquisition. We now need the number of shares after the acquisition. So before the acquisition, Ronan Limited had 5 million shares in issue, and they're going to issue 250,000 shares to the shareholders of Keller Pty Limited, because the purchase consideration is going to be settled through a share exchange. So they are going to issue 250,000 new shares to the shareholders of Keller Pty Limited. So after the acquisition, there will be 5,250,000 shares in issue. So guys, using that information, you can calculate earnings per share after the acquisition. Very simple calculation. All right, we can now discuss this in detail. So if we look at this from the perspective of Ronin Limited and also Keller Pty Limited, we have the earnings per share after the acquisition. We calculated that above. Then, before the acquisition, Ronin Limited had earnings per share of 1,200 cents, so you can just bring that down. However, for Keller Pty Limited, guys, you need to be careful. Before the acquisition, they had earnings per share of 500 cents. However, please note, before the acquisition, the shareholders had 1 million shares in Keller Pty Limited. However, after the acquisition, they only have 250,000 shares in Ronin Limited. So you can't say before the acquisition, earnings per share is 500 cents, and after the acquisition, it's 1,276 cents. You can't say that. Why can't you say that? Because after the acquisition, they have 250,000 shares in Ronin Limited. But before the acquisition, they had 1 million shares in Keller Pty Limited. So you can't make this comparison like that, because then you are not being consistent, because it's based on a different number of shares. So to make sure that you are being consistent, what you need to do is calculate the total earnings for Keller Pty Limited. So take the earnings per share, multiply it by the number of shares in issue, and calculate their earnings in total. Then just recalculate the earnings per share so that it's also based on 250,000 shares and not 1 million shares, so that you can then make a comparison. So you guys can see the calculation is just on the next page. First, calculate earnings in total for Keller Pty Limited. So take the earnings per share and multiply by the 1 million shares in issue, get the earnings in total. And now what you need to do is just divide by 250,000 shares to get the earnings per share. So you'll see now we have earnings per share of 2,000 cents. And by doing that, guys, it means that both calculations here, this is based on 250,000 shares, and this is now also based on 250,000 shares. How do I know it's based on 250,000 shares? I took total earnings, I divided by 250,000 shares to get my answer. So now this is comparable, and we can now discuss this in more detail. So you can see there's been an improvement in earnings per share for the shareholders of Ronin Limited. However, earnings per share for the original shareholders of Keller Pty Limited has deteriorated as a result of the acquisition. You can see they are worse off as a result of the acquisition. Then next, I want you to analyze the impact of the acquisition on the market value per share. And when performing this calculation, I want you to assume that Ronin Limited's price earnings multiple will be maintained, and Keller Pty Limited shares were trading at 1,500 cents per share before the acquisition. All right, so if Ronin Limited's price earnings multiple will be maintained, let's just calculate what their current price earnings multiple is. So remember, we calculate the price earnings multiple by taking their share price and dividing by their earnings. So before the acquisition, they had a price earnings multiple of 4, and that is going to be maintained. So how do we calculate a value using price earnings multiples? You just take earnings, you multiply by the price earnings multiple, and that will give you the market value. So if we want the market value per share after the acquisition, we already calculated the earnings per share after the acquisition. So you can just take those earnings, $1,276. We know that the price earnings multiple is going to be maintained, so that's your price earnings multiple, and you can get the market value per share after the acquisition. So just include that below. Then, for Ronin Limited, you already have the market value per share before the acquisition. That was given in the question. We even used that to calculate the price earnings multiple. For Keller Limited, you were told to assume, for Keller Pty Limited, you need to assume that their shares were trading at 1,500 cents per share before the acquisition. Now, please just remember, if they were trading at 1,500 cents per share before the acquisition, these shareholders had 1 million shares in Keller Pty Limited. So you can't compare 1,500 cents per share to 5,104 cents per share, because this is based on the shareholders having 250,000 shares in Ronin Limited. After the acquisition, these shareholders have 250,000 shares in Ronin Limited. However, before the acquisition, they had 1 million shares in Keller Pty Limited. So this is based on 1 million shares. So we perform the same calculation that we performed above when we were looking at earnings. First, guys, just calculate this market value in total. So take the market value per share, multiply by the number of shares in issue so that you get the market value in total. And we want both of these to be based on 250,000 shares so that we can make a comparison. So divide by 250,000 shares to get your answer. Now both of these are based on 250,000 shares, and we can make a comparison. So to conclude, we can see for the shareholders of Ronin Limited, there's been an improvement in the market value per share. However, for the shareholders of Keller Limited, the market value per share has deteriorated as a result of the acquisition.